Well, I think diplomacy is the art of engaging other countries in an effort to persuade them or convince them of the importance of the views of your own country. It's really, in large part, also negotiation. It can be negotiation, it isn't necessarily negotiation. But it's a really important attribute or aspect of sovereignty of a country. And it's certainly an important part of the practice of American foreign policy. Well, of course, the policy is set in Washington, ultimately by the President of the United States, set by the executive branch under the leadership of the President. Secretary of State is the principal advisor to the President on all aspects of U.S. foreign policy, and the principal formulator and implementer of the nation's foreign policy. So when a decision is made to follow a particular course, the order comes, first of all, of course, from the Oval Office, and then to the Secretary of State, and then down through the State Department building and bureaucracy, and then out to the representatives in the field. The Foreign Service officers who serve the country in the trenches in foreign countries are really unsung heroes in American foreign policy. I don't think that there's an adequate appreciation of what these public servants do on a day-to-day basis. Many times they serve in very, very dangerous situations under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And there needs to be a better and more expansive recognition of the contribution that they make to the security of the United States. And that's one reason, of course, why we are creating this Diplomacy Center and Museum here at the State Department, so that the message can go out to the American people and explain to them the importance of diplomacy in formulating and implementing American foreign policy. After all, in a democracy such as ours, it's the people who are the final arbiters of the nation's foreign policy. Well, the diplomats have been extraordinarily important in the founding and the prospering of our nation from the date of its founding. I mean, you wouldn't have had a Treaty of Paris without diplomats. You wouldn't have had the Marshall Plan without diplomats. You wouldn't have had a whole host of other things. You wouldn't have had a peaceful end to the Cold War, for one thing. I mean, the Cold War didn't have to end with a whimper. It could have ended with a bang, and it was the adroit practice of diplomacy that made it possible to succeed in all of those examples I just mentioned, and many, many others. I'll give you a couple of examples from my own experience as Secretary of State. While I tell people I was extraordinarily fortunate to serve when I did, because first of all, I was serving a president who understood foreign policy and had been engaged in it and practiced it himself, and had been a diplomat as our ambassador to the United Nations and our first representative to China. So President George H.W. Bush understood the importance and the nature and the nuances of the practice of diplomacy. During that 3 3/4 years, we were able to end wars in Central America through diplomatic means. Not a shot was fired. In those days, the wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua were the holy grail of the political left in the United States and the holy grail of the political right in the United States. But there were all these that came at it from 180-degree different positions. One of the first things we did in the Bush administration was diplomatic, and a negotiation not with a foreign power, but with the Congress of the United States to take those wars out of the domestic political context in the United States. Once we did that, it was easy to solve the other aspects of the problem. A more normal, I suppose, example of the practice of diplomacy back in those days was when we built an unprecedented international coalition to eject Iraq from Kuwait, practically every other country in the world. And we were then able to, in addition to that, get a resolution of the United Nations Security Council authorizing the use of force against a UN member state, Iraq, to eject them from Kuwait. That hasn't happened since then, maybe won't happen for a long time. Hadn't really happened before that time, except in the case of Korea way back in the 50s when the Soviets walked out. And all of that was made possible through diplomacy. The Madrid Peace Conference, where for the first time ever Israel was brought to the, Israel and her Arab neighbors came to the table to discuss peace face to face. That was accomplished through diplomacy. The unification of Germany within a very narrow window of opportunity against the objections, frankly, initial objections of the Soviet Union, even our allies, Great Britain and France, was accomplished by the United States and the Federal Republic of Germany through diplomacy. Again, no military means used at all. Having said all that, of course, diplomacy is best practiced with a mailed fist. So if you have, I always found if you went into a meeting, a diplomatic meeting to negotiate something, if you had the 101st Airborne in your back pocket, you could generally accomplish a lot more than if you didn't. And so those are examples of things that were accomplished during my short 3 3/4 years here through the practice of diplomacy. Well, I don't know that it's a whole lot harder. It may be. The world is a less ordered place, perhaps. I was the last Cold War Secretary of State of the United States, and in those days it was pretty easy to know what we were for. We were for whatever the Soviets were against, and we were against whatever they were for. But that didn't mean that we didn't have a lot of disparate views and positions from a lot of different countries around the world. And you know, building that coalition to eject Iraq from Kuwait involved a whole lot of different countries, and it was not too dissimilar, in my view, from what we face today. Well, of course, the support that a Secretary of State gets from the Career Foreign Service and the political appointees both is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. It is total. It is complete. These are dedicated public servants, dedicated to performing their job in the best interests of the United States. There's a little difference, but I think you need both. I know that this is a debate that continues, but I think that our democracy, our whole system of government in this country, and we've done pretty well for these 200 plus years. We've prospered. We are the best nation in the world. All you got to do is travel as Secretary of State to understand that everybody looks at the United States as the ideal nation. I mean, most people want to come here, and there's some resentment of us from that standpoint. But I still think we're based on, our country is based on a political system, and it's important that you have both career Foreign Service people involved in diplomacy and political people who can represent the president's political interests. That's important. That's the basis of our democracy. Well, I think diplomats today play a bigger role in advancing America's economic interests overseas than they used to. They didn't play as big a role, in my view, as they should have back in the days when I was Secretary of State. You know, America's power is based on primarily, number one, on our economy. Yes, on our principles and values, free market democracy, but also on our economy. As long as our economy has been in good shape, as long as we have been the number one economy in the world and a strong, prospering economy, we've been strong diplomatically, militarily, and politically. You cannot be strong, you cannot lead diplomatically, militarily, or politically if you are not strong economically. And that's one of the biggest concerns I have today. We are facing a huge debt bomb. We owe a lot more money than we should owe. And if we ever lose our primacy in the economic sphere, it's going to adversely impact our leadership ability in the world internationally. So the emphasis today on economic issues, which may have come a little bit late to the Department of State and perhaps some other cabinet departments, is extraordinarily important. But at least it's here now, and I think most people recognize it. I was a Treasury Secretary before I was Secretary of State, and I always believed that the Treasury should have the lead in economic matters. In fact, I said that when I first came to the State Department, and it created a little bit of a stir. The State Department has a role to play in economic matters. Treasury should be the preeminent cabinet department on the economy, but the State Department has a major role to play, and they have in the past and need to continue to work together to that end. Well, I don't know that it's gotten harder because, again, I think our paradigm has proven itself. And if you look around the world, most countries want to embrace the free market because the free market works and the centralized state-planned economies don't work. And so our paradigm of free markets and representative democracy has been pretty well proven to be the preeminent paradigm out there in the world. That doesn't mean that everybody is there, that all countries are there, because they're certainly not. But there's no other ideology or value system, I don't believe, that can compete with us. You know, communism is gone, radical Islamic fundamentalism is out there, but it's by its own nature limited to some extent in its appeal. And I don't know any other principle or value system that can compete with ours. Well, that's one of the main responsibilities of our embassies around the world, is to communicate America's principles and values, to pursue and advance America's national interests as those are set and expressed by the government in power in Washington, D.C. They don't change much. They don't change, those major fundamental principles and values don't change whether you got a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. But it's the job of the embassies to promote those and to explain those to the countries in which they're located, and to be America's face, if you will, in those countries. Well, the main way to get cooperation with other countries is through diplomacy. You can do it, also there are carrots and sticks. You can provide aid, foreign aid. You can also use the stick. I mean, and America has been in a pretty unique position as the de facto leader of the free world to apply that stick upon occasions if necessary. We did that when I was here. I think it was very useful and effective. You use diplomacy though to conclude the negotiation, to make the negotiation work. Well, I think it's a false choice to say that you have to either be all multilateral or all bilateral. I think an American diplomat should use all of the tools, all of the arrows in his or her quiver. And you have a lot of them. A multilateral approach is one of them. Bilateral approaches are. Sanctions are a tool that can be used. Of course, the ultimate stick is military power and force, and we are the only country in the world that can responsibly project force across oceans and continents to the extent that we can. So an American diplomat has all of those tools in his toolkit, and it's not a case of using one and not the other. It's a case of using all of them as the circumstances require. Security for our diplomats has always been a big concern. It was not as big a concern then as it is now, because terrorism has not only not been stamped out, it has grown. We still have extraordinary risks to our men and women in the diplomatic corps who are out there serving overseas. And it's something that we are paying more attention to, and that we have to pay more attention to. But diplomatic service abroad has always been dangerous. And there's a chart on the wall in the lobby of this State Department building that contains the names of those brave young American men and women who were killed in action serving us as diplomats abroad. Well, I don't know the answer to that. That's up to the security experts. But to my way of thinking, security ought to be number one. And if you don't risk, you should never risk the life of one of America's public servants in order to, because you think a particular personal contact would be more important. Then security ought to be the number one consideration. And I think today, as far as our diplomats are concerned, it is the number one consideration. George Kennan was an incredible American diplomat. I knew him. That's how old I am. I gave a speech in 1991 at Princeton right after, in the aftermath of the fall of the wall, and talking about how we should approach a weakened and collapsing Soviet Union in the future. And George Kennan was in the front row. And of course, George Kennan was the American diplomat who came up with the concept of containment, to contain the Soviet Union. He promoted that. I think he originated the word, and it worked. It worked for the full 40 years of the Cold War. It worked because we had American presidents, both Democratic and Republican, who were committed to winning that Cold War. I was fortunate enough to be the Secretary of State and incumbent Secretary of State when we won it, when the end of the Cold War came. We still had to be quite adroit in making sure that that end didn't happen with a bang, that it happened just with a whimper. And that was one of the major diplomatic achievements of President George H.W. Bush. Well, it's no secret, of course, that we have a lot of agency people in our embassies. You may not want to put that in your film, but
I meant more diplomatic observation.
But it's important. It's very important.
Understanding the culture.
Understanding the culture of other countries is extraordinarily important. The one thing you have to be cautious about is that your diplomats don't get what we call clientitis. It happens. They're sent to a country that they learn so much about the culture of the country that they become a little bit immersed in it, and they become spokesmen for that country. Not to the detriment of their own country, but it just sort of happens by osmosis. You got to be careful about that. But it is really important to have these people on the ground in other countries so that they can advise the policymakers in Washington about exactly what's going on and what the culture of the country is and how it works. Well, I don't know that the challenge is any greater than it has been in the past. The Foreign Service has a difficult job. One of the main challenges, I think, is making sure that the American people understand the importance of the practice of diplomacy and the importance of our diplomatic efforts abroad. It's easy to understand the Screaming Eagles paratrooper battalion or something. It's easy to understand the 101st Airborne when they go out and they win a big battle for America. It's not as easy to understand the battles that are won every day in the field by America's diplomats abroad. And we need to explain that to the American people, and that's one of the functions of this diplomatic museum Diplomacy Center and Museum that we're going to be creating here at the State Department. Well, I think funding has been a problem for a lot of agencies in Washington, D.C., and the State Department is not exempt. But the fact of the matter is, we have to admit it, we spend a lot of money, and we have to spend a lot of money. But I can't sit here and lobby for additional expenditures for anything today, given our debt burden in this country. I said earlier that the most important challenge facing the country today, in my view, is our economy. The minute interest rates go up, and they're going to go up, we're going to start paying humongous interest bills to China and Japan, who own our debt. And then we're going to really be hard put to fund these important. So yeah, we need to have a good solid, and the State Department's budget, by the way, is an infinitesimal part of the overall federal budget. So, and we need that, it's important. We can't cut that out, but we gotta be very careful about what we spend overall as a nation, so that we don't weaken our economy, because we can't be strong diplomatically unless we're strong economically. Well, in the lead up to the first Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush wanted to make certain that history would not say that he left any stone unturned before going to war, because this, after all, was the first major conflict that America had entered into since the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam syndrome was still very much out there. So he first proposed that he received Saddam Hussein in Washington, and he first proposed that he receive the Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz in Washington, and that he send me to meet with Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. Well, Saddam could never find a satisfactory date that didn't back right up to the deadline date we'd given him through a UN resolution saying get out of Kuwait unconditionally. So he was stalling and messing around with us. So finally we just decided, well, President Bush decided, well, you're going to go over to Geneva and meet with Tariq Aziz. And I met with him I went over there. This was about January 9th or something like that. Our deadline to get out of Kuwait was January 15th. And we had a 7 or 8 or 9 hour meeting during which Aziz kept trying to extract something from us that would be a face saver for Saddam Hussein. But we had a UN Security Council resolution saying, get out of Kuwait unconditionally, and I wasn't about to sit there and trade down from a UN Security Council resolution. And finally, at the end of the meeting, it's after about 7 or 8 hours, I said, well, Minister, that's all I have unless you have something else. And he said, no, I don't. I said, well, then we ought to talk about what we do with the press, and because there was a huge contingent of press there in Geneva. And I said, I'll either go first or you can go first. Just tell me what you prefer. He said, I'd rather have you go first. So I went down, and there was this incredibly big hall full of press. And I started my remarks by saying, regrettably, I was going to say, regrettably, I heard nothing in 7 hours that leads me to think that Saddam Hussein is going to comply with the UN resolution to get out of Kuwait. But I just said the word regrettably, and then half the reporters in the room got up and walked out to file their stories because it was going to make such a market impact. But and we went from there to war, which I tell people was a textbook example of the way to fight a war. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you tell people what you're going to do. You go out and you get an unprecedented international coalition of countries to support you in it. Then you go to the United Nations Security Council and get a use of force resolution. And then you do what you said you were going to do. And you do it in 100 hours with 140 casualties. Still too many, but that was minimal casualties, far below the estimates. You do all those things, and then you get other people to pay for it. That's the way to fight a war. And that's the way we fought that war. And we did what we said we were going to do. We did it in the time frame we said we were going to do it, and we got other people to pay for it. That too was diplomacy.